Have you ever wondered what happens in the world of Game of Thrones when the candles go out and the battles fall silent? These are the stories of unspoken words, fleeting glances, and quiet evenings that changed everything. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, get comfortable. Imagine snow falling outside the window, a fire crackling in the hearth, and we are ready to begin. The silence in Winterfell wasn't just quiet, it was special. It wasn't empty or dead, like the silence of the crypts beneath the castle where the Stark ancestors rested. No, this silence was alive, woven from countless subtle threads. It breathed. It breathed with the rhythmic rasp of the sharpening stone from Micken's smithy, where the day's labors were cooling. It breathed with the distant, almost ghostly bark of dogs from the kennels, sleepily responding to the movement of the night watch on the walls. It breathed with the whisper of the wind in the branches of the weirwood in the godswood, an old and wise witness to the changing of countless seasons. There was a weight to this silence, the weight of the stone that formed the castle walls, absorbing the cold of ages, the weight of the long summer that seemed it would never end. But Maester Luwin was already murmuring about the first signs of its waning, of shorter days and cooler nights. But this evening, something else was added to the familiar weight, something intangible and unsettling, like the faint echo of a traveler's footsteps who hadn't yet appeared on the King's Road, but whose approach was already felt in the very air. It was a premonition, a thin, taut string, vibrating somewhere on the edge of hearing. The news of Jon Arryn's death, the hand of the king, which had arrived by Raven several days ago, had cast an invisible shadow over the castle. The path of one great lord had ended, and the echo of that severed path now hung over Winterfell, hinting that another would soon begin. In the chambers of Lord and Lady Stark, this silence deepened, becoming almost tangible. It smelled of wax from dripping candles, of smoke from smoldering logs in the massive fireplace, and the delicate scent of dried herbs Catelyn Stark kept in clay bowls on the windowsill. This was a world, but a fragile world, like thin ice on an early autumn pond, beneath which the movement of dark, cold water could already be felt. Something was unspoken, unfinished. And this unfinishedness breathed in unison with the wind, creeping through a crack in the heavy window frame. At the center of this island of peace, plucked from the night's chill by the fire's glow, sat Eddard Stark. He wasn't reading reports or checking castle accounts. The evening's work was done. Parchments were neatly rolled and put away. Now his hands were busy with a different task, one that calmed his mind and brought him back to fundamentals. Before him, on a low table covered with a piece of oiled deerskin, lay ice, the Valyrian steel greatsword, a Stark family heirloom, a weapon of justice, not of war. Its dull, smoky surface seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. Ned slowly, without a single wasted movement, wiped the blade with a soft cloth soaked in special oil. This was a ritual, familiar and ancient. His strong, steady fingers knew every indentation on the leather-wrapped hilt, every ripple of the blade's pattern, reminiscent of dark water. This action was preparation, but not for battle. It was the restoration of order, an affirmation of permanence in a world that Ned felt was about to be shaken. Each stroke of the cloth across the cold steel was a silent conversation with the past, with his father, his grandfather, with all the Starks whose hands had held this sword before him. He was cleaning it not of blood, for ice did not spill blood unnecessarily, but of the dust of time, of the invisible film of haste, restoring its primal severity and purity. Nearby, in a chair by the fire, sat Catelyn. Her thin, elegant fingers were busy with needlework. A needle with gray thread deftly darted in her hands, leaving stitch after stitch on the fabric. She was embroidering a small shirt for Rickon, the youngest, and the silhouette of a direwolf was already visible on the chest. Her movements were smooth and measured, a perfect counterpoint to her husband's slow, methodical work, but her gaze kept lifting from her sewing, drawn to the fire, or to Ned's focused face, or to the dark window beyond which stretched the cold northern world. Her calm was only an illusion. Her hands were engaged in a domestic, comforting task, but her mind was far away. She was listening to the silence, trying to discern in it what so troubled her heart. Muted sounds drifted from the corridor. Bran's distant laughter, telling something to his younger brother, the creak of a floorboard under old Nan's feet as she put the boys to bed. These sounds were an anchor, keeping them in the present, in this quiet, safe evening. But that anchor seemed about to slip. Ned ran a finger along the blade's edge, sharp as a winter wind. The cold steel beneath his fingertip suddenly transported him many years back, south, to the sun-scorched lands of Dorne. The memory didn't come as battle scenes or the clang of swords. It came as a feeling of boundless, all-consuming weariness that had seeped into his very bones. He remembered not the faces of enemies, but a layer of reddish dust on his cloak, on the faces of his companions, on the manes of their exhausted horses. Dust that gritted in his teeth and clogged his lungs with every breath. He remembered the taste of warm water from his flask, tasting of leather and disappointment. He remembered the silence after the fight at the Tower of Joy, a silence louder than any screams. There was no victor's triumph in it, only the heavy burden of duty fulfilled and the bitterness of loss. He stood there, under the cruel Dornish sun, feeling infinitely alone. Even the presence of loyal Howland Reed couldn't dispel that feeling. All around were the dead, his men, and the best knights of the Seven Kingdoms, Rhaegar Targaryen's Kingsguard. And ahead, in the tower, his sister Lyanna was dying. The emotion that overwhelmed him then, and whose echo he felt now, was not pure anger or grief. It was a mixture of leaden fatigue and some fatal, inevitable acceptance. He had traveled that long, bloody path across the entire kingdom, not for glory or vengeance, but for one promise. And the price of that promise was so high that the joy of winning the war seemed alien and out of place. It was the feeling of a man who had climbed a mountain peak, only to discover there was nothing there but cold wind and the realization that he would have to descend alone. He blinked, and the memory receded, leaving behind only a phantom taste of dust on his tongue. The weight of that promise, given to his dying sister in a room soaked with blood and the scent of winter roses, hadn't lifted in all these years. It lived with him, within him. It was his scar, invisible to others, but constantly aching, especially on quiet, reflective evenings like this. He felt it now, as a dull pain deep in his chest. The return to the present was sudden, but not comforting. The present was permeated by the consequences of that past. The main consequence was Jon Snow. The boy, his bastard in the eyes of the world, was a living reminder of that tower, of that vow. Every time Ned saw his dark, serious eyes, so like the Starks, he felt a pang of that old pain. He loved the boy, but his presence in Winterfell was an eternal echo of the lie he had to maintain. Even Catelyn, his beloved wife, didn't know the whole truth, and that secret lay a thin but strong wall between them. Ned looked up from the sword and at Catelyn. She was still sitting with her needlework, but her hands had stilled. She looked at him, and in her blue eyes, Tully eyes, he saw anxiety and a question she dared not voice. From within the castle, a sound rang out that always made Ned inwardly flinch. It was the sound of blades clashing in the training yard. By day, it was a common, familiar noise, but in the night silence, it sounded different. The clang of steel on steel. Robb must have decided to practice again with Jon or Theon Greyjoy before bed. This sound was different, not like the one in his memory. There, in Dorne, steel sang a death song. Here, it was only a game, practice. But for Ned, this clang was a trigger, a reminder that brought him back again and again to thoughts of war, of duty, and of the price paid for them. He always woke up at night if he dreamed of battles. And it seemed he could hear that sound, the piercing shriek of steel entering flesh. Now it was just an echo, the shadow of an adventure, as he told himself. But this shadow breathed very close, just beyond the walls of his cozy chambers. Suddenly, the measured quiet of the evening was pierced by a sharp, guttural cry. It came from outside, very close. Ned and Catelyn simultaneously froze and looked up, their eyes meeting. It was the cry of a raven, not an ordinary caw, but an anxious, demanding cry that echoed off the stone walls of the inner courtyard. This wasn't Maester Luwin's messenger raven, whose arrival would be marked by the ringing of a bell in his tower. This was a wild chance night visitor, but in the tense atmosphere of recent days, this randomness felt like a sign, an omen. Ned slowly turned his head towards the window. Through a gap in the heavy curtains, a patch of night sky, illuminated by the moon, was visible. And for a moment, the dark silhouette of the bird cut across the moon's disk and disappeared. The bird landed somewhere on the roof or on one of the battlements. The cry wasn't repeated. The silence that followed seemed even deeper and more ominous than before. Catelyn laid her needlework on the table beside her chair. Her face was pale in the firelight. She said nothing, but Ned saw her shoulders tense. This sound, this fleeting silhouette, was the hidden event that shattered the fragile balance of the evening. It wasn't a direct threat, not a letter with a royal seal or a knock at the gates. It was something more subtle and therefore more unsettling, as if the world had given them a sign that it remembered them and that its affairs would soon touch their secluded fortress. Ned felt a chill run down his spine, completely unrelated to any draft from the window. He didn't move from his spot. Only his fingers tightened slightly around Ice's hilt. He didn't go to the window and peer into the darkness. He just sat and listened, observed. He waited, not knowing for what. Perhaps for another cry. Perhaps for another sign. But nothing followed. Only the silence, which was now filled with that piercing raven's cry, stuck in his memory. It was the beginning of movement, but so quiet and inconspicuous that one might have taken it for an imagination's trick, were it not for Catelyn's frightened eyes, reflecting his own deeply hidden anxiety. The silence was broken by Catelyn's voice, quiet but firm. She asked if Ned thought the raven was a bad omen. She spoke of old tales the Septa in Riverrun had told her, of ravens bringing tidings of death. Her words were an attempt to clothe formless anxiety in understandable, if superstitious, images. Ned slowly shook his head. He said it was just a bird. that in the north, ravens cried at night, especially when the moon was so bright. He tried to reassure her, and perhaps himself, but his words sounded unconvincing even to him. He put the sword down on the oiled leather and rose, walking to the fireplace, leaning his hand on the warm stone mantel. He looked into the fire, but he saw not the flames, but the road south, the call of duty, the call of friendship with Robert Baratheon, who was like a brother to him, pulled him towards King's Landing. He had to uncover the truth about Jon Arryn's death. Jon had been a second father to him, and to leave his death unanswered would be a betrayal. But at the same time, with his entire being, Ned felt the peace and rightness of this place, Winterfell. This was his life. These were his children. This was Catelyn. Here, everything was honest, simple, and clear. The northern land did not lie. Winter was harsh, but it was honest in its harshness. Summer was generous, and that generosity was genuine. The people of the north were straightforward and loyal. The south, however, Ned remembered his youth at King Aerys's court. He remembered the intrigues, the lies, the poisonous smiles, and the daggers hidden in sleeves. He remembered how his father and brother's journey south, to that very city, to that very red keep, had ended. They had not returned. Catelyn, as if reading his thoughts, spoke again. She said they had no business in the south, that their place was here. She spoke of their children, of Robb soon needing more responsibility, of Bran climbing walls too much and needing a watchful eye, of Sansa dreaming of knights and princes, but not knowing the true cost of those dreams. She spoke of Arya, wild and untamed as the northern wind, for whom southern manners would be as confining as a cage. She spoke of little Rickon, who needed his father. Every word of hers was a weight, pulling him back, to home, to family, to peace. And Ned felt that pull. He wished to stay. He wanted to live the rest of his days here, surrounded by snow and loyalty, to watch his children grow, and to grow old beside Catelyn. But duty was like a chain, forged in the flames of rebellion and bound by the blood of friends and kin. And he felt that chain tightening. It was an agonizing struggle between desire and duty, between a heart that longed for peace and an honor that demanded action. Eventually, the conversation ran dry. They had said everything they could aloud, but the main, heaviest thoughts remained unspoken. Ned moved away from the fireplace and returned to the table. He didn't continue cleaning ice. Instead, carefully, with a kind of final tenderness, he wrapped the sword in the oiled leather and tied the laces. This gesture was a farewell, not to the sword, but to this evening, to this fleeting sense of peace. He was putting away his weapon, his justice, his role as Warden of the North, as if saying, "That's enough for today." He made his choice, not to go. Not yet. He chose to stay here, in this room, with this woman, in this night. He walked over to Catelyn and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. He squeezed them in his warm, strong palm, trying to convey a reassurance he didn't feel himself. Then he went to the window and tightly drew the heavy curtains, cutting off the view of the moonlit courtyard and any potential ominous silhouettes on the roofs. He walled himself off from the outside world, creating their small, temporary cocoon of safety. His last action was to extinguish most of the candles. He left only one by the bedside and the living fire in the fireplace. The room plunged into a cozy twilight. Every step, every gesture was slow and deliberate. He seemed to be listening to himself, to the beating of his heart, to the voice of blood that told him to stay. He didn't rush. He stretched out these last minutes of quiet, knowing they might be the last for a very long time. It was a temporary farewell to anxiety, to the call of the road. He chose sleep, rest, the closeness of family. But even in this choice, there was an inner readiness. He was like a soldier, cleaning his weapon and going to sleep before battle. He chose peace, but his body and spirit were already taut, awaiting orders. Catelyn watched Ned move about the room, his shadow, elongated by the fireplace's flame, gliding across the stone walls. She saw in his movements, not reassurance, but merely a postponement. He had put out the candles, but he couldn't extinguish the anxiety in her heart, and, she was sure, in his own. He lay down in bed, and she lay beside him, pressing against his strong, warm shoulder, seeking protection and solace. He embraced her, and for a moment, just one brief moment, it seemed to her that everything would be fine, that the morning sun would dispel the night fears, that the raven's cry was just a raven's cry, and Jon Arryn's death a distant sorrow that wouldn't touch them. But it was only an illusion. Ned lay still, but Catelyn felt he wasn't asleep. His breathing was even, but beneath his skin, she sensed a tension, like a taut bowstring. He stared into the darkness, and she knew his thoughts were far away now, on the King's Road, in King's Landing, in the past that wouldn't let go, and in the future that relentlessly approached with every heartbeat. Beyond the castle walls, the wind howled. Now it blew, not from the north, but from the south. It carried with it the sense of melting snow, distant fields, and something else, the elusive scent of change. And in that thick, enveloping silence, broken only by their breathing and the howling wind, a silent question hung in the air. What would they say when the king arrived? What decision would Eddard Stark make when his friend looked him in the eye and asked for help? The silence offered no answer. It merely kept it in its depths, as the earth keeps seeds until spring. And perhaps, the next time they were able to spend such a quiet evening, the world beyond Winterfell's walls would be entirely different. What do you think Ned should have done? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Ever thought about silence? Not just the absence of noise, but what if it's actually alive? A breathing thing, a presence. Well, in the legendary Whispering Wood, that's exactly what it felt like. Not empty at all. More like a thick, almost touchable kind of mist, clinging to those ancient gnarled tree roots. This wasn't just quiet. No. This silence was a tapestry woven from 1,000 tiny sounds. Soft rustles, hushed sighs, the almost imperceptible creak of old wood, all blending into one deep low hum, like a giant just, breathing in its sleep. It was ancient, way older than any soldier who dared step foot there, older than their shiny swords, their grand banners, even their ancient feuds. And right now, in that heavy pre-dawn darkness, this old silence seemed to be holding its breath, just watching. It soaked up everything. The last dying sparks from campfires, the warmth radiating off sleeping bodies, the quiet thump of hearts, whispered prayers. You could practically feel the tension in it, like a bowstring drawn taut, ready to snap. It held the echo of a path, a journey that had brought thousands of men right here, and hadn't quite, reached its bloody conclusion yet. Something was left unsaid, unfinished. The whole forest just waited for the shouts, the cries, the clash of steel that was about to rip apart centuries of peace. And right there, at the very edge of light and shadow, at the heart of all that coiled anticipation, stood Robb Stark. He was part of that silence, sure, but he was also its biggest threat, the very reason it was about to die. The air around him was biting cold and damp, smelling of old decaying leaves, wet earth, and that distinct smoky scent that just screams military camp. Yeah, that was the smell of a campaign, the smell of a temporary home that could, any minute, become a grave. Robb slowly, almost silently, walked the perimeter of his camp. His footsteps barely registered on the soft, thick carpet of moss and fallen pine needles. He wasn't looking for enemy scouts, of course. He'd already placed his sentries, meticulously, precisely where they needed to be. His walk, honestly, was more like a ritual, a way to try and quiet that tremor deep inside him. It wasn't from the cold. No, it was from the monstrous, crushing weight of what the new day was about to bring. Right there beside him, a shadow moving among the other shadows, was Ghost, just gliding along. The direwolf moved with the same uncanny, soundless grace as his master, those golden eyes glowing in the gloom like two smoldering embers, catching the faint light of distant stars filtering down through the thick, thick tree canopy. Every now and then, Ghost would brush against Robb's leg, and the young man would instinctively lower a hand, letting his fingers sink into that thick, coarse fur on the beast's scruff. That simple touch, it was like an anchor, holding him right there in the present, keeping his mind from just spiraling down into that dark abyss of fear and doubt. When he finally got back to his tent, a pretty modest one, honestly, barely noticeable among the hundreds of others, Robb Stark didn't bother lighting a fire. The cold actually invigorated him, helped keep his mind from sinking into any kind of sticky, heavy slumber. He just sat down on a rough, campaign-worn stool, his sheathed sword resting on his knees. His hands, almost on their own, reached for the weapon. He didn't draw the blade, though. Instead, his fingers, all calloused, you could tell, from constant contact with leather and metal, they just methodically checked and tightened the straps on his gauntlets. The leather itself was old, worn smooth, soaked through with sweat and road dust. It remembered so much. The warmth of his hands on those freezing nights in the mountain passes, the cold sweat before his very first skirmish with Lannister outriders. It was just a simple, almost mechanical thing, something every warrior knew how to do. But for Robb, it was more than that. As he untied and then retightened those taut knots, he felt like he was somehow bringing order to his own mind, unraveling that tangled mess of thoughts that had been plaguing him all night. Every little creak of the leather, every faint click of a metal buckle, it was like a small, affirming sound in the absolute deafening silence of anticipation. He didn't even look at the map on the table. Why would he? He knew it by heart. Every single river bend, every little grove, every hollow where an ambush could be waiting. He didn't reread dispatches. They'd all been read already. Decisions were made. No. Now, in these final few hours of peace, he wasn't preparing an army. He was preparing himself. He was, in a way, drying his cloak by an imaginary fire, smoothing out non-existent creases, cleaning his boots of mud that existed only in his memories of that long, exhausting journey. This was preparation for something, well, insignificant in the grand scheme of battle, but absolutely vital for a young man who needed to face the dawn as a king, not just a frightened boy. Ghost, of course, settled down right at his feet, resting his heavy head on his master's boots, letting out a soft sigh, a little puff of steam hanging in the chilly air. Rob's gaze unfocused then, just kind of drifted, and the soft creak of the leather in his hands became a sort of backdrop for a memory that just surged forward. He was there again, back at the neck, that really significant border where the harsh, honest north finally gave way to the softer, yet oh so treacherous lands of the south. He didn't remember the tactics for crossing the swamps, or even the speeches he gave to his bannermen. What he remembered was the feeling, the way the air itself changed. It became humid, heavy, smelling strangely of both decay and sweet flowers all at once. He remembered how, for the very first time in his life, he felt like a total stranger in this land. Around him were his people, sure, loyal Northmen, whose faces were weathered by the very same winds that had shaped his own. There was the booming Great John Umber, whose laughter, could literally drown out a storm's roar, and the silent Rickard Karstark, whose eyes had just seen too many winters. There was Lady Mage Mormont, with her warrior daughters, all of them stern and unyielding, just like the bear on her sigil. They all looked at him, and in their gazes, Rob saw more than just simple loyalty to their lord. He saw hope. Fragile, yes. Desperate, certainly. But it was the hope of an entire kingdom, laid squarely on his shoulders. The shoulders of a 17-year-old boy who, just a year ago, had probably only thought about hunting and tournaments. In that moment, standing there on the stone causeway, surrounded by thousands of warriors, Robb Stark felt a piercing, all-consuming loneliness. He was their leader, their banner, their young wolf. But not a single one of them could share the sheer weight of that title with him. No one could truly look into his soul and see, not a confident commander, but a boy who desperately missed home, missed the easy laughter of his brothers, the stern but deeply loving gaze of his father. This memory didn't bring any thrill of adventure, no, only its opposite, a weariness that settled deep in his bones, and a loneliness colder than any northern wind. Robb blinked, pulling himself back to the pre-dawn gloom of the Whispering Wood. The sensation from the past hadn't just vanished, it had left its mark, its lingering shadow. He felt that familiar, nagging ache in his shoulders, as if that invisible burden he'd taken on back at the neck had just stayed with him, become a part of him, almost. This wasn't the kind of weariness that disappears after a good night's sleep. Oh no, this was a different kind of exhaustion, ingrained deep in his muscles, in his very soul. He ran a hand over his forehead and felt a barely perceptible furrow between his brows. He knew for a fact it hadn't been there a year ago. It had appeared during this campaign, etched in by sleepless nights spent poring over maps, endless councils with his lords, and those terribly grave decisions on which so many lives depended. This was, in a way, his first scar, only he didn't get it from an enemy sword. He got it from the crushing burden of power, a scar no one else saw, only him. Beside him, Ghost whimpered softly in his sleep. Robb lowered his hand again, burying his fingers in that thick fur. The warmth of the beast was, honestly, the only real warmth in this cold, cold forest. He remembered how, throughout that entire journey south, his sleep had become so light, so broken, any unfamiliar sound, and he'd wake up with a pounding heart, and his hand already on his sword hilt. He particularly remembered the cry of an owl. You see, In the northern forests, owls called differently, but here, in the south, their cry just seemed ominous to him, like a warning, a bad omen. Every single night he heard that sound, he would wake up. It wasn't really a direct threat. No, more like a constant chilling reminder that he was deep in enemy territory, that peace was merely a brief respite, not something you could count on. The shadow of his adventure, his journey, it breathed right beside him. It sat on the chair opposite. It watched him from the darkness between the trees, and its breath felt like the very whisper of the wind through the leaves. Suddenly, the silence changed. It wasn't broken by a loud noise, though. Quite the opposite, actually. It grew even deeper, as if the entire forest just held its breath, all at once. And in that ringing, almost painful emptiness, a single, sharp sound echoed. A snap, a dry branch, just breaking under someone's weight. The sound itself was faint, barely there, but in that absolute frozen stillness, it rang out like a gunshot. Rob froze. His fingers, which had just moments ago been idly tracing the glove straps, clenched on his sword hilt with such force that his knuckles turned stark white. His body tensed up like a bowstring drawn to its absolute limit. His breath caught in his throat. Ghost reacted even faster, if you can believe it. His head snapped up instantly, ears pricked forward, and a low, almost soundless growl rumbled deep in his chest, like the distant tremor of an earthquake. The fur on his scruff bristled, standing straight up. He didn't bark, didn't howl. He simply stared, locked on the direction the sound had come from, into the impenetrable darkness beyond the last row of tents. Rob slowly, oh so slowly, turned his head in the same direction. His eyes, now well accustomed to the gloom, strained to make out any movement, any silhouette that didn't belong to the forest itself. But he saw nothing. Just black tree trunks, standing like frozen sentinels, and a tangle of branches silhouetted against the ever so slightly lightening sky. There was no light, no shadow, no further sound. The silence that followed that snap was even more oppressive than before. It wasn't just the absence of sound, you see. It was a hushed, lurking stillness. Rob didn't dare to act. He didn't jump up, didn't raise the alarm. He simply sat there, becoming all ears, all sight, one continuous agonizing expectation. This was that hidden moment, that tiny, unclear trace that could mean absolutely anything, or absolutely nothing at all. It could have been a deer, just carelessly stepping on some dry brush, or it could have been one of Jaime Lannister's scouts. This uncertainty, it was more terrifying than any overt threat. It was the beginning of movement, a quiet push that set the entire intricate mechanism of the coming battle into motion. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The silence remained unbroken. Nothing happened. Rob slowly exhaled, realizing he hadn't actually been breathing at all that time. The tension in his body eased slightly, but it definitely didn't vanish completely. He stayed on high alert. A silent dialogue began in his mind, a weighing, a pondering. He replayed the sound over and over. If it was an enemy, they were either alone and acting extremely carelessly, or perhaps incredibly daringly, testing the sentry's vigilance. But if it was just an animal, then his own reaction, that icy spasm in his chest. Well, it spoke volumes, didn't it? He was on edge. He was waiting for the strike so intently that he was ready to see it in every rustle, every passing shadow. His thoughts, naturally, shifted to the approaching dawn. The plan itself was bold, daring, almost insane, really. to lure Jaime Lannister's cavalry right into this forest, where the trees would become their allies and the narrow paths a deadly trap. The plan looked good on paper. It sounded great in the tent during the war council. But now, in the pre-dawn silence, Robb felt its fragility, its precariousness. Too many ifs. What if the scouts had erred? What if Jaime didn't take the bait? What if his men faltered? What if he himself faltered? He felt this powerful urge toward the risk, this intoxicating anticipation of battle, the almost magnetic call of a path that would lead him either to glorious victory or to ignominious death. But simultaneously, he felt another pull, a pull toward peace, toward the silence that had been here just minutes ago, toward the simple, comforting warmth of the direwolf sleeping beside him, toward the very thought of Winterfell, its snow-covered walls, where the greatest danger was, well, just the frost. This was a battle within himself, a struggle between the desire to remain on this last island of quiet and the relentless call to move forward, to steel and to blood. He remembered his father's face, Ned Stark, when he'd left for King's Landing. In his eyes, then, was the same weariness and the very same resolve. And Robb, he understood then, that he truly had no choice. The path hadn't been started by him, no, but he absolutely had to finish it. He had to go. This realization, strangely, didn't bring relief, but it did bring a certain clarity. The battle within him was over. He had made his choice, or rather, he had simply accepted the choice that had been made for him the day news of his father's arrest had arrived. He would stay. He wasn't going to flee from fate, or hide behind his men's backs, or desperately seek an easier path. He would remain here, in the Whispering Wood, on this patch of ground that would soon be soaked with blood. He would remain and wait for dawn. And he would meet that dawn not as a boy yearning for home, no, but as the king in the north, leading his army into battle. Robb took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, clean air fill his lungs. Then he relaxed his fingers, loosening that death grip on his sword hilt. The gesture was barely perceptible, almost invisible, but for him, it meant a great deal. It was a silent farewell to doubt. He lowered his hand once more and just buried his fingers in Ghost's thick fur. The wolf responded, licking his palm with his hot, rough tongue. It was their silent agreement. Then Robb rose, walked to the tent entrance, and pulled his heavy wolf fur cloak tighter around his shoulders. This gesture, too, was a temporary farewell. He was bidding farewell to this night, to this silence, to the very last moments of peace. He was wrapping himself, deliberately, in his destiny, in his immense responsibility, in the cold, unyielding steel of the coming day. He extinguished his only real source of light, and I don't mean a fire, but his internal turmoil, his deepest fears. He listened to himself, to the new, cold resolve that had taken firm root within him. But he wasn't in a hurry. Dawn hadn't broken yet, and these last few minutes of silence, they belonged only to him. He stood there at the threshold of his tent, gazing out into the darkness from which no sound now came. The forest whispered again, but now its whisper seemed different to Robb. It was no longer a whisper of anticipation, of waiting. No, now it was a whisper of promise, a promise of battle, a promise of glory, and yes, a promise of death. Ghost stood right beside him, as still as his master. Two stark silhouettes against the slowly lightening east, a youth and a beast, a king and his shadow. Robb looked up at the sky. Through the thinning tree crowns, he saw the stars, the very same stars that shone over Winterfell. But here, in the south, they seemed alien, cold, utterly indifferent to the fates of the men stirring below. He thought that after this day, for many of his warriors, these stars would extinguish forever. And for those who survived, would the whisper of this forest ever truly change? Would it ever cease to echo in their ears with the clang of swords and the groans of the dying? He didn't know the answer. He knew only one thing. Dawn was incredibly near. And whatever it brought, the young wolf was ready to meet it. Perhaps one day, he would again see the dawn over the peaceful walls of his ancestral castle. Next time, perhaps. But that, my friends, would be an entirely different story and an entirely different dawn. If you felt the weight of this moment with Rob, please hit that like button. What do you think was the biggest burden on his shoulders this night? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the world of our favorite stories. Have you ever experienced a silence so profound, so utterly wrong, that it felt heavier than any noise? You know, the kind of quiet that just hangs there, not peaceful at all, but thick, waiting, almost like it's holding its breath. That's the deceptive quiet of Dreadfort. It wasn't the calm stillness of a snow-covered forest, not the peaceful hush of an ancient library. No, this was a compressed, waiting silence, thick as clotted blood. It just soaked into every stone of that castle, cold and completely indifferent to any human suffering. Every corridor, every vaulted ceiling, they all seemed to stand there as mute witnesses to unimaginable horror. The very air hung heavy, brimming with unspoken words and unshed tears. In this crushing atmosphere, Sansa Stark felt something more than just an absence of sound. She felt the undeniable presence of something suppressed, something buried deep, deep down. It was almost like beneath the castle's foundations, there lay a forgotten city, and its ghostly inhabitants were still trying, desperately trying, to cry out to the living world. This feeling of incompleteness, you know? Like a crucial chapter of history had just been ripped right out, leaving the remaining pages soaked and moldy. The path that had brought her here didn't just end. It stopped abruptly, right in the middle, leaving her in this weird, timeless limbo. A stone tomb, where the past was a constant curse, and the future? That was just an unthinkable luxury. But even in that oppressive quiet, you could feel the faint breath of movement everywhere. It was there, in the subtle draft, creeping under her ill-fitting chamber door. You could hear it in the barely audible clink of chains, somewhere far below, and in the distant, almost subconscious wail of wind against the battlements. This wasn't a wind of change, though. Not at all. It was merely an echo of what might have been, a haunting reminder of a freedom that once felt as natural as breathing. Something remained unsaid. Something broke before it ever reached its end, and that feeling just hung there in the air, cold and sharp, like a shard of a shattered mirror. Under the dim light that barely filtered through the narrow slit window, Sansa sat on the edge of that hard, uncomfortable cot. Her movements were so slow, so measured, as if she were still recovering from some incredibly long and arduous journey, even though her travels had long since ended within these suffocating walls. Her fingers, thin and pale, fingers once accustomed to delicate needlework and the soft touch of harp strings, now awkwardly smoothed the coarse fabric of her simple dress. She'd run her palm over the gray material again and again, flattening non-existent wrinkles, It was a mechanical, almost unconscious action, a way to keep her hands and her mind busy, to distract from that gnawing, constant fear. In this small, repetitive ritual, there was this strange shadow of preparation for something insignificantly important, as if she were about to take just an ordinary stroll through the Winterfell gardens, not another dreaded meeting with her tormentor. She undid and rebraided a thin plait near her temple. Her red hair, dulled by the perpetual gloom, seemed like the only bright spot in that grim, gray cell. Each movement was a quiet attempt to restore some semblance of order in a world where absolute chaos reigned supreme. It was like a traveler, after a long journey, cleaning the mud from their boots, or drying a wet cloak by the fire. A simple, earthly action that for just a brief moment brought back a tiny sense of control over one's own life. There was no haste in her gestures, just a focused silence, a subtle hint of the long path she had traveled and the one that might still lie ahead. She wasn't preparing for an event. She was preparing for the survival of another day, for the necessity of donning the mask of submission again to hide the unconquered soul still beating within her. This small ritual was her anchor, her silent affirmation that Sansa Stark was still there, beneath all those layers of fear and humiliation. Suddenly, just as her fingers paused on a strand of hair, a memory exploded into her consciousness, bright and piercing, like a sunbeam blasting into a dark dungeon. This wasn't some episode from her long and terrible journey, south or back north. No, this was a pure emotion, a clear, unclouded feeling from another life, from the past. She saw herself as a little girl, standing on the wall of Winterfell. Her palms rested on the cold, rough stone, but this cold was different. It was invigorating, real, alive. Below, the winter town stretched out, wisps of smoke curling from chimneys, mingling with the frosty air. It smelled of snow, of pine, of hearth smoke, the unmistakable scent of home, the smell of absolute safety. There was no one around, just her and the vast northern lands under a low, gray sky. In that moment, she didn't feel delight or joy in their usual sense. What she felt was a profound sense of belonging, a deep, unbreakable knowledge that this was her place, her world. It was the feeling of roots, stretching deep into that cold earth, giving her strength and confidence. It was loneliness, yes, but not the desolate, frightening kind she felt now. This was a peaceful, self-sufficient loneliness, a loneliness in which one could truly dream. Now, in the suffocating confines of Dreadfort, that memory was almost physically painful. It brought her no comfort at all. Instead, it only sharpened the agony, emphasizing the terrifying abyss into which she had fallen. The very emotion of that day, calm certainty and quiet strength, that was the true core of this vision. While the action itself, that simple adventure of her childhood, remained merely a background, blurred and distant. The memory melted away as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste. Sansa was sharply pulled back to the brutal present, and the cold of her cell felt even more penetrating, if that was even possible. It seeped beneath the thin fabric of her dress, settling deep into her bones, making her shiver faintly. This wasn't just a physical reaction to the low temperature. No, this was the cold of fear, a fear that had become her constant, uninvited companion. She felt the brutal consequences of her long, agonizing journey in every aching muscle, in the dull pain in her back, in the constant tension that never left her, not even in sleep. The chilling shadow of her so-called adventures if you could even call her wanderings and captivity that, breathed close by, relentless as a hound on a scent, and the sounds, drifting up from below, were a constant grim confirmation of this. From Ramsay, Bolton's kennels, came that low, guttural growl, occasionally interrupted by a short, furious bark. This sound had become the horrifying soundtrack to her new life. It was a constant, barking reminder of the cruelty that reigned within these walls, of the terrible fate that awaited anyone who dared to displease the master of the castle. Sansa knew she always woke when she heard that sound. Even in her deepest dreams, the ones where she walked through Winterfell again, those dogs' growls broke through the veil of sleep, dragging her back to this nightmarish reality. It wasn't a direct threat in that very moment, but it was a raw scar on her soul that throbbed with every single touch of Dreadfort's reality. The weariness she felt wasn't just physical. Oh no, it was a weariness of the soul, utterly exhausted by the constant expectation of pain and humiliation. That day, everything unfolded as usual, until Ramsay himself arrived. His appearance was always sudden, always devoid of any warning, like a viper striking. He said absolutely nothing, just grabbed her arm with his hard, strong grip and dragged her along the cold stone corridors. His silence, let me tell you, was far more terrifying than any screams. Sansa walked, desperate not to stumble, her heart pounding somewhere up in her throat. He led her to the kennels. The smell hit her immediately, a sharp, overwhelming stench of wet dog, rotting straw, and damp stone. Dozens of eyes watched them from the darkness of the kennels, and that low growling grew into a deafening, terrifying chorus. In the far corner of the kennels, lit only by the dim, flickering light of a single torch, she saw him, Reek. He was cleaning buckets, his back bent in a humiliating bow, even when his master wasn't nearby. He was dressed in filthy rags. His dark hair, greasy and matted, fell over his face, obscuring it. He moved nervously, with this constant trembling fear, flinching at every sharp sound, every dog's bark. Sansa tried desperately not to look at him. The sight of this broken creature filled her with a strange mixture of revulsion and an inexplicable, painful pity. Ramsay was saying something, his voice insidious and cruel, describing his favorite bitches, their habits, their bloodlust. Sansa nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor, on anything but the dogs or Reek. And then it happened. For just a fraction of a second, maybe he felt her gaze, or perhaps it was just a random coincidence. Reek lifted his head. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, in that unexpected hidden event, Sansa saw something absolutely incredible. Behind that mask of terror and servility, in his clouded, frightened eyes, she saw not the monster named Reek. She saw a phantom, the phantom of Theon Greyjoy, the same confident, audacious youth, her father's ward, who had eaten with them at the same table, who had laughed at her brother's jokes. It was only a glimmer, a shadow of a long-gone person, but it was unmistakably recognizable. In his gaze, there was no hatred, no malice, only an abyssal chasm of suffering, and something else, recognition. He, too, saw not Ramsay Bolton's wife, but Sansa Stark of Winterfell. The gaze broke as quickly as it began. Theon immediately lowered his head, shrinking even further, as if he himself was frightened by his own momentary boldness. Sansa froze, her breath caught in her chest. She showed no outward sign, her face remaining an impassive mask. But something inside her had irrevocably shifted. In the cold, barren soil of her despair, a tiny seed had fallen, a seed of an unlikely, almost unthinkable alliance. Back in her cell, Sansa sat in the dark for a long, long time, not bothering to light the candle. The silence no longer felt oppressive. It had actually transformed, becoming a sacred space for deep reflection. The image of Theon, that quick glimpse of his true self in Reek's eyes, stood before her with incredible, painful clarity. She weighed this new knowledge, this fragile discovery, with immense care. On one side of the scales lay pure, undiluted anger. Theon Greyjoy was a traitor, plain and simple. He had seized Winterfell, betrayed her family, caused the deaths of so many loyal people. He was responsible for the false news of her younger brother's deaths, news that had shattered her world into a before and an after. This resentment and hatred were deep, justified, absolutely. She had every right to wish him the same agonizing fate that had befallen him. But on the other side of the scales was what she had seen today. She saw not a conqueror, but a broken toy in the hands of a true monster. A man reduced to such a state that his own name became a source of searing pain for him. He was as much a prisoner as she was, even if his prison was built of torture and psychological abuse. The risk, the risk was enormous. Any attempt to establish contact, any careless word, or even a glance could be noticed by Ramsay, and his wrath would be terrible and inventive beyond belief. He could use it against both of them, turning their shared suffering into a new, twisted kind of game. Inside Sansa, two powerful desires fought a silent battle. The first, the undeniable pull of a new path, a call to action. This tiny spark of hope beckoned her, offering a chance to change something, to find an ally in this absolute hell. Perhaps together they could... What? She didn't know. But the very thought of together was intoxicating, a dangerous, thrilling possibility. The second desire, peace. The peace of sheer survival. To do nothing. To risk nothing. To continue being a shadow, submissive and unnoticed. This path was safer. It promised less pain, or at least predictable pain, the kind she had almost grown accustomed to. To stay and wait, or to step bravely into the unknown, where either freedom or an even more terrible demise awaited her. The choice was made without words, in the profound silence of her heart. Sansa slowly rose and went to the narrow cot. She wouldn't act. Not yet. The seed that had fallen into her soul was simply too fragile. It needed time to take root in the darkness, to gather strength, before it could even dream of breaking through to the light. Any hasty step, any impulsive move, could destroy it entirely. She chose not to go further down this dangerous path that had so suddenly emerged in her mind. But understand this, it wasn't defeat or retreat. No, it was a strategic pause. Internally, she was ready. For the very first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt not only fear, but also a quiet, fierce determination. Hope, however faint, had utterly changed the inner landscape of her soul. Now she was not just a victim, passively awaiting her fate. She had become an observer, waiting for the precise, right moment. Her gesture was simple, yet packed with meaning. Sansa wrapped herself more tightly in the thin, scratchy blanket. This wasn't so much for physical warmth as for a kind of protection, as if she were hiding her newfound, precious secret from the world. She listened to herself, to this new, burgeoning feeling inside, giving it time to strengthen, to solidify. Then she went to the small candle end, the only source of light, and carefully blew out the flame. The room plunged into almost absolute darkness. This gesture was a temporary farewell. She was bidding farewell to the idea of immediate action, to the impulse that could have utterly destroyed her. She chose patience. She chose darkness as a temporary refuge for her hope. She was not in a hurry anymore. Now she had something she didn't have before. A purpose, however vague, however distant. And for that purpose, she was willing to wait. The darkness deepened, but it didn't bring with it the usual soul-crushing despair. In this darkness, something profound had truly changed. From below, from the kennels, sounds still drifted up. A quiet whimper, the scrape of claws on stone, a rare deep growl. But now, for Sansa, these sounds took on a brand new meaning. It was no longer just the noise of horror emanating from her tormentor's lair. Now, it was also the very place where she had seen a fleeting glimpse of humanity in the eyes of a broken enemy. The place where her fragile, almost insane hope had been born. And that single fact, my friends, changed absolutely everything. Was this glance a trap? Another one of Ramsay's twisted games? Or was it a sincere, silent cry for help from the man buried beneath the persona of Reek? She didn't know the answer. This question hung in the cold air of her cell, silent and persistently demanding. She lay sleepless, gazing into the profound darkness, and felt that for the very first time in long, agonizing months, her loneliness was not absolute. Somewhere down there, among the growling beasts, there was another prisoner who remembered Winterfell. And that trace, that fleeting, shared glance, left a potent sense of possibility blooming in her soul. The next time their paths crossed, perhaps everything would be profoundly different. If you found this deep dive into Sansa's struggle compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe for more explorations into your favorite stories, and let me know in the comments below. What do you think Sansa should have done next? Who would have thought that the fiercest warrior in Westeros, a man whose face was disfigured by fire and whose heart seemed forged from steel, was capable of tenderness? Sandor Clegane, better known as the Hound, was the embodiment of brute force, ruthlessness, and cold cynicism. His nickname perfectly reflected his character. Loyal to his masters as long as it was convenient, merciless to anyone who stood in his way, leaving a trail of broken lives and empty hopes. It seemed as though nothing alive could stir a drop of compassion or warmth within him. But even the cruelest dog has a corner where something pure is kept, untouched by the world's harshness, something he guards from prying eyes like his greatest secret. For Sandor, this hidden corner, this stronghold of genuine trust, was his horse, a mighty and loyal stallion named Stranger. It was this unusual, almost intimate ritual, unfolding against the fading twilight sky, that would make Arya freeze and watch. The girl, accustomed to life's harshness and unpredictability herself, couldn't help but notice the striking contrast between the Hound's formidable, at times terrifying appearance and his gentle, almost tender treatment of the animal. She would hide behind a massive cart or a tattered tent, making sure her small, nimble figure remained unnoticed by the tall, silent man. Arya was used to seeing him only as a kidnapper, a sullen companion, a cynic, a man who would stop at nothing for gold, for his own gain, or simply for a bottle of strong wine. She had witnessed his anger, his coarseness, heard his caustic remarks and threats. But these evenings, when Sandor cared for Stranger, pulled back a curtain on something entirely different, a facet of his nature she hadn't even suspected existed. It was like looking at the other side of the moon, something that had always been there, yet remained unseen. The evening sky painted itself in crimson, orange, and violet tones, foretelling the swift arrival of night and a drop in temperature. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying with it the scents of fresh, trampled grass, damp earth after a recent rain, and a faint, almost imperceptible aroma of smoke from a long-extinguished campfire where only glowing embers remained. Through these scents broke the distinctive, slightly salty smell of horse, a smell that, for Sandor, was probably one of the most soothing. Sandor approached Stranger slowly, without a single abrupt or unexpected movement. His footsteps, usually heavy and confident, capable of shaking the ground, now seemed surprisingly soft, almost silent. The horse, tall and powerful, with gleaming dark brown fur, stood calmly, only flicking his large, attentive ears slightly as his master drew near. There were no words between them, not a single sound uttered by a human voice. Only absolute, perfect, silent understanding, built on hundreds of miles of traveled roads, on shared dangers lurking around every turn, on an unchanging, unwavering loyalty that had never once been questioned. The hound would place his enormous hand, covered in hard calluses from his sword, heavy armor, and constant contact with the reins, on Stranger's powerful, warm neck. There wasn't the slightest hint of fear or nervousness from the animal. The horse would just gently rub his large, soft muzzle against Sandor's broad shoulder, making a low, guttural sound, something between a snort and a contented sigh. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a gesture the hound seemed to bestow upon no other living creature in this world. He allowed no one else that close. And this touch, this silent greeting, was the beginning of a sacred daily ritual. Sandor would pick up the brush, an old, well-worn one with a faded wooden handle and stiff but gentle bristles, meticulously cleaned of dirt and stray hair. He would begin to groom Stranger's mane. The horse's long, thick hair, the color of a raven's wing, was matted after a long day's journey, soiled with road dust and bits of leaves stuck within it. But under Sandor's skilled, surprisingly delicate movements, it gradually came into order, each strand straightening and smoothing. The brush glided through the coarse strands with a quiet rustling sound, almost like the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Sandor's hands worked methodically, rhythmically, without the slightest haste or impatience. This wasn't just mechanical animal care. It was a kind of meditation, a sort of sacred act. For the hound, who was constantly in a state of battle readiness, whose body was tensed and mind alert, these moments with his horse were perhaps the only time he allowed himself to truly relax, to let down the heavy, invisible armor with which he protected himself from the world. His back would straighten slightly, his shoulders would drop, and his heavy breathing would become more measured. Stranger would quietly snort, sometimes flicking his long tail slightly to ward off unseen insects, but otherwise stood absolutely still, enjoying every touch. He knew that this man, at times so terrifying to others, would never, under any circumstances, harm him. On the contrary, Sandor was his protector, his source of food and water, his unchanging, loyal companion in a world full of dangers, predators, and endless battles. Their bond was fundamental, primal, and therefore incredibly strong. It didn't require complex dialogues, ornate phrases, or empty promises. Only presence, only actions, only unbreakable trust. It was a pure, primordial sense of security. Arya, continuing to observe from her hiding place, inadvertently compared this to how the hound treated her. Roughness, sarcasm, undisguised threats, sometimes even physical aggression. This is what she saw in every day they spent together, in every interaction. Her world with Sandor was full of harsh words and threats, But with his horse, he was completely different. His movements were fluid, his breathing even, and his gaze, though hidden beneath his scowling, scarred brows, seemed almost calm, almost peaceful. It was almost inconceivable, looking at his usually grim, perpetually sullen, fire-scarred face, on which a grimace of pain and discontent was fixed. But in these moments, his features softened, as if under the influence of an invisible warmth. After the mane, Sandor would move to the horse's body. He ran the brush along Stranger's broad, muscular back, down his powerful, taut flanks, along his strong legs, carefully removing every particle of dust, every grain of sand and dirt that had clung during the long day's journey. Every stroke was purposeful, caring, devoid of haste or carelessness. Stranger's fur, dark brown, almost black, began to shine, reflecting the last fading rays of the setting sun, shimmering with all the shades of chocolate and night. The hound checked the hooves, carefully lifting each of Stranger's legs, examining it for stones, small splinters, or any possible injuries that might cause his companion pain. His enormous, seemingly clumsy fingers, despite their apparent roughness, were surprisingly nimble and sensitive, capable of noticing even the smallest problem. He was attentive to every detail, to every signal his horse might give. Then came the most anticipated part of the ritual, the turn for water and fresh, nutritious oats. Sandor would bring a heavy bucket filled to the brim with clean, cool water, which he had carefully drawn from the nearest well or stream, and an old but sturdy leather sack from which he poured fresh, fragrant oats into a specially adapted trough. The quiet crunch of oats, ground by Stranger's powerful teeth, filled the evening air, mingling with the coolness and the scents of the night. This sound was for Sandor, perhaps, the most pleasant melody after the din of battle, the creaking of cartwheels, or Arya's irritating voice. He stood beside, simply watching Stranger eat, his huge figure casting a long shadow in the moonlight that began to peek through the clouds. In these moments, Sandor didn't seem like the hound, didn't seem like a ruthless mercenary. He seemed simply a man, tired, but finding solace in the simple act of care, in the silent, deep satisfaction of knowing his only friend was fed and content. Stranger was not just a means of transport for him, not just a riding horse bought or acquired. He was a comrade, the only creature who never judged him for his past, never feared his fire-scarred face, never betrayed him, never tried to use him for selfish purposes. The horse was unwavering in his loyalty, and this was for Sandor, that rare, precious anchor that held him in a world where betrayal was commonplace and loyalty an ephemeral dream. There had been so much pain in his life, so many disappointments, so many people who tried to use him or harm him, from his own brother to the king. But Stranger, never. He was the only one who accepted the hound as he was, without masks, without lies, without expectations. He was his mute confessor, his silent therapist in a world that gave him no peace. Arya continued to watch, her keen gaze missing no detail. She saw how Sandor gently, almost timidly, stroked Stranger's muzzle when he finished eating, how he whispered something to him, words that were too quiet for anyone but the horse to catch, whose ears sensitively reacted to every sound. Perhaps they were just meaningless sounds, words of comfort, or even an admission of his strange, unaccustomed affection. In any case, it was a gesture of intimacy, completely uncharacteristic of the image of the hound she knew, the image of a fearsome lone wolf. She felt that this was something he would never show anyone else, especially her. Sometimes, when Sandor finished grooming and sat down nearby, leaning against the cart, or a large stone, or simply against stranger's flank, the horse would gently lower its enormous head, pressing against his shoulder or hip. And in these moments, in this silent, trusting contact between the rough warrior and his loyal horse, Arya saw something more than just a bond between master and animal. She saw a glimmer of humanity in the most unexpected place, in the most unexpected person. She saw the loneliness the hound shared with his horse, and the comfort they found in each other. Two solitary beings, forced to wander the roads, finding support only in each other. It was a tender, almost fragile moment, sharply contrasting with the brutality, cruelty, and inhumanity of the world around them. A world where people fought for power, where blood flowed like a river, where every morning brought new threats and new trials. But here, in the deepening shadows of twilight, under the gaze of distant, indifferent stars, there existed their own small, impregnable island of peace and absolute trust. Here, time seemed to stand still, and all worries receded. For Sandor, who had experienced hell, both literally and metaphorically, for a man whose soul had been burned not only by fire, but by betrayal, Stranger was his refuge, his salvation, his reliable anchor, his only true friend. The horse was the only creature the hound didn't teach to fear, but taught to trust, showing him his true, hidden facets. And this was their secret, shared secret, belonging only to the two of them. A story, written not in words, but in millions of steps on dusty roads, in thousands of touches, and in the silent, deep understanding that bound one man and one animal in this cruel, indifferent world. And Arya, unexpectedly, became a silent, unseen witness to this astonishing, almost tender love she never expected to see in such a man. In this silent ritual of caring for his horse, in these quiet, soothing evenings, the hound allowed himself to simply be Sandor, a man who, despite all his cynicism, his gloom, and his outward invulnerability, needed affection, support, and silent understanding. And Stranger was the one who gave him that affection, without questions, without judgment, unconditionally, without any demands in return. It was something rare, something genuine, something that survived despite all the horror and pain Sandor had endured. And this bond was, perhaps, the strongest, purest connection that ever existed in Sandor Clegane's cruel, yet not entirely stone heart. The only creature the hound trusted, that was his faithful stranger, his shadow, his reflection, his silent protector. And this trust was his greatest, yet well-hidden strength. It showed that even in the darkest, seemingly most hopeless corners of the soul, light can exist, a thin thread of humanity, or perhaps just a very quiet, but so important crunch of oats that fills the night with peace and hope. If you found this glimpse into the hound's softer side as surprising as Arya did, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more deep dives into your favorite characters.